Why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Okay, so my name's Elizabeth Woods. Do you want my full name? I think it's okay. So I'm Elizabeth Woods. I'm 56 and I currently work for a trustee company.
So my name is Hannah McIntosh and I am a senior 2D artist at a company called Cerebral Fix. There I also help manage the art team as the discipline lead. So I manage about 20 artists there. I am originally from Canada, but I've been here for 13 years. I'm actually a hybrid, so I'm half Canadian, half Kiwi. Age-wise, 26. Hobby-wise, video games are kind of an obvious one, working at a video game studio.
I was a banker for years, so that was my main kind of role. That was my main thing that I did. I got into banking after I ran out of money at uni and just had to go get a job. So I got into banking, and then I left my husband when they were kids younger and became a solo mother and went back to working full time. And I worked in publishing for a while, which I absolutely loved, so I was working for a publisher for quite a long time as well.
Also really absolutely adore Halloween. It's my absolute favorite holiday and I wish Kiwis did more of it. And in my spare time I like to foster cats. I help out with a local charity called Cat Rescue.
I do a lot of acting, so I love theatre. So I do a lot of acting, play the piano, play a lot of music, lots of gardening and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And who do you admire and look up to in your life?
I think there's so many amazing people in history that I think lots of people don't get even acknowledged for the good work they do.
My sons, obviously, like I'm super proud of both my sons because particularly the younger one who's on the spectrum, he's Asperger's. So he's had some real challenges, he's had some massive challenges throughout his life.
Probably one of my unsung heroes I have is my previous head of studio, Nadia Thorne, who I think my company would not be where it is without her input and her influence. She fought really hard for changes in culture and I'm very thankful for her.
I was lucky to have the experience of growing up next to two amazing women. Oh, look at me, see that makes me tearful. And if they were still alive, absolutely, they were my role models. And I quite often now, because I live in their house, so I ended up buying their house. And a lot of what I do, I recognise that a lot of my behaviours and a lot of my beliefs and things have come in part from my own family, but in part from those two women as well. So I find there's real echoes of the way that I am now that have come from them because they were just incredibly strong businesswomen in an era when it was not the done thing at all. So this is in the 1950s and 60s. I think a lot of my strength and or a lot of my outlook comes from growing up with them because I live next door. I first turned up on their doorstep when I was 3.5 and I knocked on the front door and I just never kind of left really. So I grew up between the two houses, so I had my family, who were lovely, and then I had these two amazing women next door. So yeah, I definitely looked up to them as well. They were businesswomen in a time when that was difficult. And the older one was one of the first female chartered accountants in New Zealand. And she started from absolute nothing. She started as a shorthand typist at an engineering company. Discovered that she had this absolute love of maths and figures and business. Went back to night school, trained as a chartered accountant, and she ended up as the managing director of the engineering company eventually. They were doing things in a time when women were really expected to marry and have children and that was it. So the word empowered is kind of a weird one, but do you know what I mean? They were very empowered women. But even though they were empowered, they still stuck to the kind of societal norms because they were partners, and I'm sure they were partners, but it was never discussed. They were companions, so you know it was never discussed that they were partners. They wouldn't have referred to each other as partners, they were friends. And it wasn't until the older one died, so when Jane They were both called Jean. So when the first Jean died in 2001, and Jean Edgar was absolutely grief-stricken at Jean's passing, and it became very apparent that there had been far, they loved each other very deeply, but they never talked about it. But I think we just knew, do you know what I mean? Everybody knew. So yeah, I grew up with that as a role model, and they were, oh yeah, boy, the older Jean, she was terrifying, but she wasn't terrifying to me because I loved her, and I was one of the few people that she would say, I love you too, but she had to be tough. I mean, that's the other thing, she had to be very tough in a world where you had to be twice as tough as a man because otherwise people didn't take her seriously. And I know it was quite sad when the first Jean died, when Jeannie Mac died, and Jean Edgar was getting ready for her funeral. And I came up because I was very much the daughter figure for the both of them. I came up, and Jean Edgar was in her room crying her eyes out. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, everyone's going to expect me to wear a skirt. I hate wearing skirts, because she always wore trousers. She said, I've got a skirt, but it's ugly and I don't want to wear it. And I said, why do you have to wear a skirt? And she said, well, everyone will expect me to wear a skirt to the funeral. And I said, oh, what a load of bullshit. I said, come on. I said, what would Jean want you to wear? She said, trousers. I said, right, put your trousers on. And she did, and she laughed, But it was just that horrible kind of, this is what people are going to expect me to do. They're going to expect me to wear a skirt. So it was like, no. They had wonderful parties, and of course they existed in a society. They were part of a group in Christchurch who were artists and writers and painters. They were very close friends with Manaia Marsh, and so there was this really artistic surrounding that they had. So there were quite a few other women who were couples who were part of their social circle as well. And I never thought anything of it. It was just the way it was,
What does feminism mean to you exactly?
To me, I think feminism is a very loaded word, but to myself, I think it's kind of just acknowledging that everyone's human and trying to create an equitable world, making sure that everyone's treated as a human and that there's not different levels of equal in a sense.
When I was growing up, my mother was was a bit of a feminist. Well, what I would have termed a feminist, so, she believed in equality and that sort of thing. So I always was raised to think of feminism as being a good thing. Although my father was pretty traditional, came from the West Coast and was quite traditional. So my father would sometimes use the word feminist as an insult. Not as a nasty insult, but do you know what I mean? It was a kind of a derogatory thing, sort of. But I always grew up thinking it was a good thing. To me, feminism means equality, not I'm better than anyone else, or that I hate men or anything else, but that equality for men and women. And when I say men, I mean all genders, right? One of the things I find hard now is in recent times, and I mean relatively recently, feminism's almost become a bad thing. Do you know there's a certain element of society that thinks that feminism is a bad thing? And I think they've lost sight of the fact that feminism to me always meant equality.
Throughout history, particularly in the 19th century, it was widely considered quite patriarchal. So how do you think society has progressed since then in terms of women's rights?
Yeah, no, we've definitely made a lot of leaps and bounds since the 1900s. I can go on birth control, for example. That's a big one. I can have my own bank account. That's another big one. I think it's just we've created, if we're talking about from a female lens, we're creating a world that's a lot less dependent on kind of male counterparts. I've read articles and stuff about even as late or early as 1990s, there was women who would struggle to get mortgages in New Zealand because they were single females and they wouldn't have a male signatory. So banks would be less willing to lend, even though the rules would allow them to. People just have unconscious biases that they would have to make them think that people are less good with money or less trustworthy, which affects women a lot, but it also affects other underrepresented groups like people of color especially experience this a lot, which is another important thing. I think is not just about standing up for our rights as women or people who are able to menstruate and stuff. It's about making sure that everyone is in a more equal and just kind of environment.
And I think traditionally, because women have been, I mean, let's face it, women have been subjugated for centuries. I mean centuries. It's long time. So that those early days, those early suffragettes and things like that, or those early people, that's my concept of feminism, is fighting for that equality. I don't quite know what would be the modern definition of feminism. I mean, I was reading a fascinating book not that long ago called Living Dolls, which talks about how women are now, they say, oh, dress however you want. If you want to dress like a pole dancer or whatever, wear whatever you want, oh, that's empowering. But in fact, there's still an element of that being for the patriarchy, you know, so that to me is fascinating, that we still don't have equality. I think we've made a lot of progress.
There's definitely this kind of idea that we've already got to a really good spot, which I don't think people appreciate just how modern a lot of these changes have been. The real unfortunate, like, kind of big elephant in the room is if we look at like Roe v. Wade in the States, that's like a traumatic thing that's happened to women and people who are able to give birth. That's such a loss of control, and like so many people fought so hard for that and are still fighting really hard, and I know I was super upset when that happened. It's hard to empathize with changes that don't affect you as much, or situations, especially when the status quo like greatly benefits you.
I was talking to an older friend of mine just recently about, you know, feminism, and she said she feels sometimes she doesn't want to say that she's a feminist because she feels she'll get a backlash for that.
I found that there's kind of this pushback, especially from white males, on almost saying that feminism has gone too far and that now they're taking away all the, it's like unfair to them, which I guess from their lens it does look like that, but when you look at the wider picture, it's very much not the case. It's not reflected in the stats or anything, and I think it's it's hard.
Look, I'm very accepting, you know, I work with all sorts of people, it doesn't bother me in the slightest, but I had not really thought of that concept, and she was quite sad about it because she genuinely felt like she was somehow wrong for saying she was feminist. And I thought that's sad because those women fought so hard to even to get the vote, for goodness sake, you know.
I really respect people who can empathize and help advocate for women in different spaces and other underrepresented groups in those spaces when they don't have any personal stake in it themselves. Like, I think that's a true good person.
My grandfather was a psychiatrist on the west coast in Hokitika, and he was quite a sort of a visionary type of a psychiatrist, because he arrived at Seaview Mental Hospital probably in the 50s, and when he got there, there were women there who had been locked up for literally decades for postnatal depression. Some of them will have been given electric shock therapy for being gay. And so he arrived there, and there were women in there who by that stage were completely, you know, they had mental illnesses because they'd been locked up and drugged out of their eyeballs for 30 years. But they'd been locked up for things that now, you know, just would have been treated. And it was because they were women.
I think a lot of people who haven't educated themselves about issues that don't affect themselves personally but affect other groups will tend to kind of see feminism for like, we're giving my rights to someone else, and that means that there's less of the pie for me, which when you're looking at, say, the pie has like 9 slices and 9 of those go to men and everyone else gets the 1 slice at the end. If we wanted to make more equal kind of space, we would be giving more of that pie away, which does take opportunities away from others, but it also means that we're getting way more voices into spaces, and you get a much more robust and diverse atmosphere when it's not just, say, like especially in my field, it's very male dominated. A lot of white guys. You just like, you make assumptions when you're not part of an other group.
You know, it must have been a really difficult time, and I did some family research not that long ago, and discovered that my great-great-grandmother, who was born in Wales, came out to New Zealand, and she was one of the women who signed the suffragette petition, you know, in the late 1800s, you know. And of course that was a huge thing, and their husbands hated that these women signed it, you know, because women did not have rights. Go back a bit further, they couldn't own land, they could have their children taken away from them, and there was absolutely no, you know, you weren't allowed to be divorced if you had an unfaithful husband or an abusive one, you know, tough. And that's terrible. So we have come a huge way. I think women have come a long way, but I think there's still quite a long way to go. I think we've talked about, you know, before with that concept of the hydra. You think you've made lots of progress and you chop a head off and it pops up somewhere else. Use that a lot.
It's very descriptive, I can visualise that.
Yeah. So, you know, it's that concept of you want equality, but it's lacking in so many places still.
And what types of patriarchal issues do you think women today are still dealing with?
When you look at video games, like there's a lot of ones where, say, the females are very scantily clothed, or you have kind of problematic stereotypes about like people of color, like the Asians just like doing kung fu and that's like their main trait. Almost always a case that you don't have the right voices in the room to like kind of put their hands up and say, hey, actually this isn't how we want to represent people, like this isn't how I like to be represented. This is derogatory and it doesn't make me feel powerful. It feels like you're mocking me in this space.
I was up on the 4th floor, if you know what I mean. So I was in the business banking, and I was just as good a banker as any of the men. And even now, even though women hold high level jobs, one of the things I find fascinating is if you go into any corporate office, the men are in suits, the women are still in skirts and high heels most of the time. Well, they're uncomfortable. You know, why are we doing this? Why are we wearing high heels and wearing makeup and you know, looking that way? Because if I had turned up at work, you know, in a suit, flat shoes, no makeup, being comfortable, I would have got some very strange looks.
But they don't see it because they've never had to think about it that way. They just think, oh, if we take the kung fu examples, like they're doing some cool moves, but they don't understand the context behind those and the nuance, because like kung fu's like very regional to different parts of the world, and you can't just blanket statement and say all Asians do kung fu, for example. Just like all women aren't wanting to be sex symbols. Some women want to be like the scientists and the smartest person in the room, and they may not want to present themselves in the way that males want them to see them. They want to present themselves in a way that makes them feel powerful and strong, and it's not necessarily need to be in the lens of the male gaze kind of thing.
So there's on a whole lot of levels. So there's an appearance one, you know, that's at the very basic surface level. I can remember as a young banker, so my very first job, I was a data entry operator, and I was the lowest of the low. I was the office junior. Every day I had to take the manager and the accountant, who were of course both men, they were always men in those days. Every morning I had to take them morning tea on a silver tray, right? Cup of tea, biscuits, and I had to go in there and I had to pour the tea.
So before I started at CFIX, I did the multimedia design course at ARA. Really enjoyed it, but I will admittedly say that I was one of 3 females in the class, and you definitely felt it. I think probably the hardest thing is just like knowing that like you are the other, so like you're kind of have a spotlight on you a bit. So
now, when we had a young male banker, he didn't have to do that. That was never his job, because that's not what boys did. So that doesn't happen anymore. But you still get
put through a magnifying glass a bit. And I think that was really hard for not just myself, but the other females in my course. Not to say it wasn't a great environment. Like, I think they did an excellent job. There's definitely just the small cuts, you know. I remember, actually funny enough, we had some Cerebral Fix people come in, the company I work for now. They were doing some school tours, and they came in to show us about video games, and they did the presentation. I was like, oh cool, video games, yeah, this is what I want to do. And I asked at the end of the session, I'm like, how many females work for you? And they paused for a moment, and I know all these guys personally now, and they're all great guys, but I could see the unconscious biases coming through at that moment, where they paused for a moment, and they're like, 2, and then they were like, oh, there's this person, they're like, oh, she doesn't count. And I was like, oh. So they were scrambling to figure out how female representation was in their studio, and that there were jobs that didn't count even though they were in the same workplace. So I was like, well, instead of being discouraged by that, I was like, I'm gonna take this as a challenge. I'm gonna be in that space. I see a gap, I'm gonna fill it.
I work with a guy who is lovely, but is an older man, and I was sitting next to him and we got the email saying, look, it's International Women's Day tomorrow. We're having a webinar in the morning if anybody wants to come and join. We're going to be talking about the glass ceiling and you know, women not being promoted. And he said, ugh, what a load of bullshit. International Women's Day. When's International Men's Day, as I'd like to know. And I said, well, probably the other 364 days of the year, actually. So I complained about him. I went to my boss and I said, listen, we have young women in this office who have business aspirations. And I said, that's a terrible role model, because of course they'll be going,
you're a bad person and you haven't thought about me. It's not us calling people a bad person because they have assumptions and different lived experiences. I think they misunderstand people calling out these issues and advocating for themselves, because it's easy for people to fall into the trap of being real defensive.
Because they've been brought up to think that way. And so in a business setting, yeah, the dress, the language, particularly in banking, if a woman talks loudly and forcefully, she's called bitch, or she's called, oh, look at her, God, she's so, you know, she's so aggressive. If a man does it, they're called proactive.
Called assertive.
They're called assertive and proactive.
But what we're asking is for them to actually listen and let us tell our stories, and then also put action with that.
I think that's a pressure on women. I think women have to work extra hard to be accepted, because there's this constant awareness of the burden of sexism. It's just something that you grow up knowing that that's the way it is. You walk into a petrol station, it's like, actually look at my eyes, not my breasts. You just go with it because that's what you are used to. Like, I look at my sons, I look at someone like you and, you know, Michael and those sorts of people. There seems to be a far greater sense of equality.
One thing that surprised me that not everyone thought about was when it's late at night. I don't know if you've done this before, but you're walking down the street and you're like, you go through your head, you're like, okay, what can I use as a weapon if someone attacks me? I'm like, okay, I'm taking my shoes off and hit them with it and then run faster. And then describing this to some of my guy friends, they're like, oh, I've never had to think about that. And I was like, oh. I just thought this was something that everyone had to experience.
And I know a lot of theatres now have a sexual harassment policy, because back in the day, you know, when I started acting, it was really common for the older directors to be having relationships with the younger women. I overheard a conversation, a very young actress who I had met through one of my sons, and she dropped into the conversation, or she mentioned that she had felt that she had been sexually harassed by this much older man. And I knew them, I knew the theatre company, I knew them, and I thought, oh, hang on a minute. And I said, look, what happened? And she told me, and I was so disgusted. I was so horrified and so disgusted, because this girl was the same age as my sons, you know, and I thought, as a mother, how would I feel if I knew this had happened? So I complained about it, I raised it, and I was absolutely shot down in flames, even though he admitted he'd done it. And his attitude is, well, that's what happens in theatre. I think the saddest thing was that there were women in that organisation who protected that, who banded against that and protected it, because their attitude was, oh, that's the way he is.
In like my work, I've been lucky enough that I've had quite a supportive environment. There's definitely been a lot of growth that we've had. I've always had really good allies and really good support systems. in the workplace, which unfortunately isn't the same lived experience that many women in the games industry has. One of the more famous examples at the moment, there's a company in the States called Riot Games. They had some sexual misconduct cases. It has ended up being a $100 million lawsuit that they've had to pay out.
And they've been told for so long, you have to protect yourselves. Don't walk down dark alleys at night. Don't wear provocative clothes on the street. Don't do this, don't do that. We don't say to men and we don't say to our sons, don't rape women, don't attack women, don't do this, don't do that. We make it the victim's fault. So the woman's burden is to look after themselves or keep themselves safe or protect them. We don't say to men, don't do that. And so there's this kind of inference there that men can't help themselves.
And I think it's really important to make sure that you have enough diverse voices whenever you're in different situations, because you're always going to have your own biases, and it's important to have more people in the room so you're not just making assumptions about things. This kind of touches on like tokenism. Say there's 10 people in a room, 9 of them are men, 1 of them is a woman. It's very easy to get into tokenism, and it's not always malicious. Often it is out of good place where people are like, oh, we want to make sure people feel welcome. But if you're 1 in 9, then you're gonna have to really fight to advocate for yourself and educate people on why your viewpoints matter. And the way to get away from tokenism is to put actions with your words and to actively add more voices into that space, because
I don't think every woman is a feminist. You know, I'm sure that there are quite a few women out there, and I don't mean just women my age, because, you know, you still see women who are beaten by their partners or who suffer subjugation, who don't believe that they are worthy of equality.
Say you're designing an outfit for a new female character. All the stats are showing that scantily clad outfits with like boob armor and stuff, that stuff is selling. People are loving it. But you might bring up, well, this is all our male viewers and our male gamers are the ones buying this, but we're not seeing that same shift in the female population. They're not buying these skins at the same time. And it's because they don't see themselves represented in that. And also, if you want to get really into it, it's not historically accurate. If you had boob plates like they have there, you would destroy your ribcage if you got struck in the chest. So it's not even historically accurate. You have to fight really hard to kind of get that, because they won't see the problem in it. But if you have more female voices in that situation, then you almost seem to have more of a case, because now 2 people, 3 people are saying this and bringing it up because they have a shared experience and shared empathy in the situation.
I think self-reflection's a difficult thing, particularly if you're brought up to believe that. I think more it's a case of walking alongside them and going, why do you think like that? Where do you think that attitude comes from? Did you have people who said that about you? Because I think the minute you attack someone who's got a really ingrained belief, that's it, the shutters are going to go up, they're not going to listen. My partner, who's lovely man, he talks about he really had that epiphany in his late 40s, and he realised that actually he was quite sexist, and he could be, you know, he's quite open about the fact that he had some really ingrained beliefs from his parents, and that's completely different. So it's perfectly possible to come to that understanding, but rather than it being I'm going to beat you around the head with this and tell you you're a sexist pig, you know, actually sit down and go, you know, where does this come from? What do you think?
And a lot of people aren't aware of it.
They aren't. They're not aware of it.
Internalised misogyny.
No, that's a good term. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I agree with you. Like my partner's a lawyer, and you know, he recently said to a colleague, you know, I'd really like to be an advocate for women who are having trouble in the workplace, because he's a very good employment lawyer. And she was quite furious. She said, we can talk for ourselves, thanks very much, and gave him a bit of a slap down. And it's like, you know, it's so wrong, because I mean, there's no reason why he can't be a feminist just because he's a male. Just 'cause he's got a oh, sorry, can I say that?
So like, even just like having that awareness that we unconsciously do that stuff, and it's not a malicious thing most of the time. Not a malicious thing most of the time, but like we will tend to have like things that we've been just like conditioned to think in different ways, and challenging that conditioning.
And I can remember my sister's father-in-law saying to me, you've bought that house on your own? Yes. Well, are you going to have a man to live there as well? No, I've bought this house on my own. I said, I don't have a husband and I can handle this myself, thanks. But it was this absolute unconscious sexism all the time. And the thing is, unless you analyse that for yourself as a woman, it's very easy to just get sucked into it. Oh yes, I can't do that myself. Oh, I do need a man to do it for me. Oh no, I can't use a hedge trimmer because I'm a woman. And you'll come up against it, particularly in male-dominated industries.
To be honest, I think one of the hardest things about sexual harassment in the workplace is often we hear the cases of kind of the bigger ones that don't feel big enough in isolation to report, but end up growing and growing. And by the time that you do report it, doesn't seem like much. Once you're in a safe and comfortable position, or as safe as you can, do report it, because even if it's just a small thing, like say they just kept on touching you or they said some really derogatory terms to you, you should still report that, especially if you have HR or hopefully you have an understanding boss, or at the very least it's on record, so that if it's happening to you, it's unfortunately likely happening to others as well.
There are structures in place, there are systems in place for you to be able to speak up.
Know your rights, know what you should be getting paid, what things that like legally you are allowed to get. Don't just settle for the status quo.
And don't ever be afraid to do that, because the only way it'll change is if people speak up.
Find someone you trust who you can just be real with and kind of problem solve together, and you shouldn't deal with it alone. It's a big issue, and you will probably be surprised, as you're saying, on how many people can empathize with it.
Hold your head up, be yourself. You have every right to be there and be who you want and do the best you can. You're there for a reason. You're in that business because you have that skill set, and you're not defined by your gender.
In roles that you want to do.
This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or girl. You see, man made the cars to take us over the road. Man made the trains to carry heavy loads. Man made the electrolyte to take us out of the dark. Man made the boat for the water, like Noah made the ark. This is a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or girl. Man thinks about all his little bitty baby girls and his baby boys. Man makes them happy, 'cause man makes them toys. After man's made everything, everything he can, you know.